Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. One of the things I love about watches is these tiny little metallic things. There's not much to them, is there? And yet, two grown men, two grown people can look at it and see such vastly different things. Think and feel such vastly different things. What separates that view is endlessly fascinating to me. And this came home to me yet again a little while ago when Morgan Stanley released their kind of annual who's selling what for how much kind of industry review of the Swiss watch industry. And something that really struck me was the difference between, or more to the point, the similarities between Tudor and Tag. If you look at that report, and people argue about the accuracy of that report, but that's all we have right now. And I'm going to guess that the analysts at Morgan Stanley are certainly more likely to be right than you or I. One of the things they said was, according to their numbers, Tudor and Tag are quite similar. They sell, Tag sells a lot more watches, but they're not totally out of the ballpark. And if you scoot across to the other side of the chart, the value of their watches, the average value of the average Tudor and the average Tag, is very, very close. In a world where most people in the enthusiast community are running around comparing Tudors to Omegas and Breitlings, then this report was kind of a crashing back to earth, saying that in reality, in terms of the average value of the average Tudor sold, it's similar to the average Tag. So why is it that we have such an elevated idea of who Tudor is? We in the enthusiast social media world have an elevated view of who Tudor is and such a deflated view of who Tag is. I'm a Breitling fan. That's a brand I tend to associate with, and I'm absolutely well aware of the disdain many people feel for that brand, and it constantly surprises me that where people get that from. On the other hand, I can't connect at all with Rolex. I feel somewhere, but I don't feel very warmly towards the brand, let's say. And yet, I've got to deny that Rolex has probably the most rabid fan base in the watch community. So what I've been doing is thinking about where are the dividing lines? What are the questions what are the different ways of looking at this that separate us as a community? This is my longest intro ever. Watch to after the little intro music, and I'm going to talk about what I see are the questions, the inflection points, the breaks in logic that separate how some people look at brands from others. Okay, so I think the first thing that I've noticed in the way different people look at different brands, and I'm going to go back to our Tudor and Tag example, is some enthusiasts tend to look at the best of a brand and other enthusiasts tend to look at the worst of a brand. If you go on social media, as I said before, you look at the Morgan Stanley result, the average value of the average Tag and the average Tudor sold are around about the same. That would indicate that they are batting it out at around about the same level in the marketplace. However, if you ask any kind of enthusiast on social media, they will drive Tudor up and they will drive Tag down. What's going on? What you're seeing there is, if you dig a little deeper, you'll notice that people only ever talk about the best of Tudor. You go onto social media, you'll go onto Facebook, you'll see discussion after discussion around Black Bays and maybe the Pelagos. And no one will ever talk about the 1926s or the 12, I think, other collections that Tudor has, most of which are really cheap and most of which are let's just say uninspiring, and can be routinely bought at huge discounts. On the other hand, if you ask those same people that are always talking about Black Bays, about tag, they immediately start talking about quartz aqua racers and quartz Formula Ones. No one's talking about in-house column wheel chronographs that come from tag. It's funny, when Tudor has a screw up and mucks up their date, it's all kind of laughed off. Even though it made it to customers, when Tag had their difficulties with the silicon hairspring assessment they were trying to do on those Octavias, none of those problems of which made it to customers. They were just issues within the production organization. They were used as a way of beating Tag to death. So I think the first thing is, and I'm not just using those two, but there's an example of how one of the things that separates us is when we choose to look at a brand, do we look at the best that they make, or do we look at the worst that they make? The next thing that separates us in how we look at brands is, do we look at the whole brand, or do we just look at the watches that are of interest to us or the argument we're making? This really came home to me recently when I was watching Adrian on Bark and Jack, who did a video about Hublot and how Hublot is really poor value for money. It's all show, no go, all that sort of stuff. And in doing so, the example he used was one of their watches, their entry-level classic Fusion. Now, what's interesting there is that's a watch which even really keen Hublot lovers will tell you doesn't really represent the brand well. It's not the most commonly sold watch that Hublot makes. I believe that's the Sang Bleu. But still, it's the one that suited Adrian's point, and so it's the one he used to then represent the whole brand. And you can do that with anyone. You can pick any brand, and if you want to make the point that they're good or bad, there's almost certainly going to be a collection you could use. So I think the second thing about how that separates us is when some people look at a brand, they try and look at the whole brand, or they look at the selections that they like. Other people, when they look at a brand, will look at the watches they don't like and will use those as a representative upon which they'll base their opinion. Okay, so the third sort of way of looking at brands that separates us, and these are all kind of little subtle distinctions of each other's, is, do we define a brand by their most sold watch, or do we define the brand by their best or most iconic watches? I'll bring us to Rolex here. It's widely believed and often reported that the single most sold Rolex is the Lady Datejust. That makes up 50+% of Rolex sales, and all the other watches are their kind of prestige halo pieces. It would be true then, if that's true, and the only evidence I've got would tend to indicate that way, if that's true, then it would be fair to characterize Rolex as a maker of Lady Datejusts that has a sideline in Submariners. But no one characterizes Rolex that way. Everyone focuses on the Submariner, even though the Submariner, those steel sports watches, even though they're a very small percentage, maybe less than a quarter, maybe less than 20% of Rolex's throughput. So one of the things, again, that splits how the community sees a brand is whether people within it choose to define a brand by the bulk of what they sell, or do they choose to focus on the icons, the halo pieces, and say these are somehow separate from the rest, but also define the brand? Another question that splits how individuals look at a brand is, do you look at the watches that they make available to you and are popular where you are, or do you look at them through the lens of what they make available elsewhere? The example I'll give here is Longines. Longines is a bit of an interesting brand in that there's two distinct Longines. You could almost say there's a Western enthusiast Longine and an Eastern enthusiast Longine. In the West, Longine is all about the heritage line. The only, really, the occasional Hydra Conquest gets a bit of a run, but primarily the only Longines that get any real coverage in the Western media are the heritage lines. From what I understand and from talking to people that have been to Asia, those are something of a sideline, almost an embarrassment to Longines in Asia. In Asia, it's all about the master line. It's all about those new modern watches. And so when you're thinking about a brand like Longines, or perhaps like Seiko, or perhaps like Citizen's perhaps even a better example, where you've got this split between all their good stuff going to the east and their more mall, department store oriented stuff coming to the west. How do you assess that as a brand? And I think that's one of the things that splits us as a community. How do we answer that question each ourselves? The final thing I'm going to put on this list is, do we buy into what the brand says about itself? And again, here I'm going to say, take Bremont. There are those people who kind of buy into the whole, aviation, military support, that sort of thing. And there are others who look at it a bit askance, who don't really own it, who think that, and by and large, I put myself in that category, feel a bit removed from this history. Those who buy into the history, who buy into that kind of story, tend to see the brand very differently from those who don't, from those who sort of can't quite grasp that history, don't feel it as part of them, don't think it's real. Well, I'm on Bremont. There's a really interesting thing here, because I agree. I have said a number of times, for example, I think their kind of military aviation thing is kind of pushed a bit too far, kind of made a little bit too obvious. And yet, I've got to say, as a member of the military who has spoken to people who have themselves worked directly with Bremont, people within squadrons and forces trying to organise for, say, Bremont commemorative watches for their unit, they've reported Bremont is a breeze to work with, really great, and offer the services amazing discounts. So perhaps, having learnt some of that, maybe I'm warming to them a little bit in that story. So you'll note I've really tried very, very hard not to really place a position on any of these, because I don't have one. And what's worse, I know I shift backwards and forwards. I know that for some brands I'll look at their best, and at some brands I'll look at their worst. And I know you do too. You can see it. I got to this point by analyzing a whole bunch of comments and videos and blogs, and you can see people doing the same thing, picking and choosing, moving things around, comparing the best of one brand to the worst of another. Only sticking with what's available to them in their country for one brand, but then reaching over to Japan or reaching over to Germany for the best of another brand. So we're all picking and choosing, and I think that's perhaps unavoidable. It's part of being human. We come into this with ideas of who's good, who's bad, who we're going to like and who we're not. And then what we do is, when we get to these questions, we don't apply the question fairly. We fiddle the knobs. We put our thumb on the scales and bias the answer to match our preconceived ideas. Are we doomed? No, we're not. And the point of this video is really to say this. If you believe what I'm saying, and I certainly do, then what you should do is try and remove that bias by concentrating on it. By asking yourself, the next time I look at a brand, the next time I say something about Tag or about Tudor or about Rolex or about Breitling or about Omega, about anything, am I, before I say another word, am I thinking of everything? Am I applying the same rules to them that I apply to my favorite brands? Or conversely, if I'm talking about my favorite brands, am I applying the same rules to them that I apply to the brands I hate or don't like very much? I shouldn't use the word hate. I think if we can ask ourselves those questions, if we can start to get past the rapid fire biased lizard brain part that leads us to say horrible and wildly inaccurate things on Facebook or in the comments to videos like mine, and perhaps start to be smarter and be better at this. Anyway, that's it. That's my little homily / rant today. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. I'll see you later. Bye.